Imagine being at the height of success, living in luxury with millions in your bank account and the world at your feet. But suddenly, everything you know is taken away. You're thrown into a nightmarish world of isolation, violence, and despair. This isn't just a story of a mogul falling from grace, this is the untold reality of Sean Diddy Combs' time behind bars. In September 2024, the arrest of music mogul Sean Diddy Combs at Miami International Airport shocked the world. Federal agents took swift action, and Diddy's sudden detention stemmed from his desperate attempt to flee the country. Within hours, he was transferred to the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn, a place infamous for its unspeakable conditions. Once described by a federal judge as dangerous and barbaric, MDC Brooklyn has a dark legacy. It's a facility that has earned its reputation for inhumane treatment, and despite the judge's warning, became the reality Diddy would endure for the next 15 months. What followed was a harrowing ordeal as leaked footage began to surface, exposing the grim reality of life behind bars at MDC Brooklyn. The leaked videos showed inmates enduring conditions far worse than anyone could have predicted: overcrowding, violence, and neglect. It wasn't just a matter of facing a trial anymore. It was a fight for survival within a system that seemed more focused on punishment than rehabilitation. MDC Brooklyn, a facility located in Brooklyn's Sunset Park neighborhood, was designed to house 1,000 inmates when it opened in the early 1990s. Today, however, it holds more than 1,300 prisoners, with overcrowding a consistent issue. In fact, in 2024, the Federal Bureau of Prisons made the shocking decision to stop sending sentenced individuals to the facility altogether. When the agency responsible for overseeing such institutions makes a move like that, it signals a profound crisis, one that has been simmering for years. This facility has been home to some of the most infamous figures in recent criminal history. The list is a veritable who's who of high-profile criminals: R. Kelly, Ghislaine Maxwell, Sam Bankman-Fried, and Jeffrey Epstein before his transfer to Manhattan. From drug lords to rap stars, MDC Brooklyn has become a holding ground for notorious figures, people whose names have gripped the public's attention for years. And today, figures like Luigi Mannon, accused of murdering the CEO of United Healthcare, await trial in the same squalid conditions. In 2026, the facility would add another name to its grim roster. Nicolás Maduro, the former president of Venezuela, was captured and transferred to MDC, further solidifying its reputation as the holding place for the infamous and the dangerous. The MDC over the years has become a symbol of neglect, violence, and systemic failure, its notoriety cemented by the endless line of prisoners it holds. The conditions inside have made headlines time and time again, as judges, lawyers, and even former inmates have spoken out about the horrors that unfold within its walls. In a facility where security and human rights seem to be afterthoughts, it's no surprise that Diddy found himself not only facing the legal consequences of his actions, but also navigating an environment where danger and violence were part of daily life. Diddy's experience at MDC Brooklyn was a far cry from the glamorous life he had once known. Before his arrest, he lived in a sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion in Miami, surrounded by luxury and comfort. But now his world had been reduced to a cramped 10x8-foot cell, a space barely large enough to contain the steel cot on which he slept. Gone were the soft sheets, plush pillows, and the comfort of privacy. Instead, Diddy faced the cold, hard reality of a prison cell, with a mattress so thin it was little more than a sheet of fabric. The conditions he endured were nothing short of appalling. Michael Cohen, former fixer for President Trump who had spent time in a similar facility, described his experience with brutal honesty. "I can assure you it's disgusting. The food, the living conditions, they are beyond unbearable." And for Diddy, this was the stark contrast between his former life of indulgence and the grim prison life he was now forced to endure. From the moment Diddy arrived at MDC Brooklyn, he was placed in the Special Housing Unit (SHU), a section of the facility typically reserved for high-profile inmates. This unit, often justified as a measure for protection, was nothing more than a hellish form of solitary confinement. In SHU, Diddy's existence was limited to just 1 hour of recreation per day, an hour in which he was allowed out of his cell to stretch his legs or engage in minimal physical activity. The remaining 23 hours were spent locked away, isolated from the rest of the world. The psychological toll of such confinement was unimaginable. Yet the isolation was not the only threat Diddy faced in this high-security prison. Those who surrounded him were not just ordinary prisoners, they were individuals accused of some of the most heinous crimes. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as these were people who had nothing to lose, and their presence made survival a constant life-or-death struggle. The best way to describe it: a war zone where the only rule was survival and the stakes were higher than ever. Even the simplest movements within the facility were fraught with danger. Whenever Diddy needed to be moved from one cell to another or from one section of the prison to another, he was shackled and surrounded by guards. Maximum security measures were enforced at every step, with every movement watched and controlled. This level of constant surveillance was a far cry from the freedom Diddy once enjoyed. Every day in MDC Brooklyn felt like a step deeper into a claustrophobic nightmare. It was a life governed by steel bars, handcuffs, and the crushing weight of isolation. But the real terror didn't just come from the confines of his cell or the constant monitoring of his every move. It came from the pervasive culture of violence within the prison walls. Inmates regularly attacked one another, and even when guards were present, they often turned a blind eye to the violence. MDC Brooklyn was a place where life seemed disposable, where survival meant navigating a brutal maze of hostility, neglect, and cruelty. The culture of violence was not the only issue plaguing MDC Brooklyn. The facility's failure to provide basic human necessities only compounded the suffering. In 2019, the prison's already deteriorating conditions reached a breaking point when a catastrophic electrical failure left the entire facility without power for an entire week. With no heat, no lights, and temperatures dropping to a bone-chilling 2 degrees F, inmates were forced to endure unimaginable conditions. They banged on the windows, pleading for help, but their cries were met with silence. The situation quickly escalated, leading to protests within the facility. Inmates demanded to be treated like human beings, not animals. The crisis eventually resulted in a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the 1,600 inmates trapped inside. The lawsuit painted a horrifying picture: broken toilets, a complete absence of fresh air, no sunlight for days, and a total disregard for the inmates' basic health and safety. The conditions at MDC Brooklyn were so horrific that even federal judges, who are typically reluctant to criticize the facilities they oversee, were forced to speak out. They condemned the prison's failure to meet even the most basic standards of decency, a failure that continued unchecked despite repeated warnings. What transpired in the aftermath of this crisis was a stark reminder of how broken the system was. Federal judges, once inclined to turn a blind eye to such conditions, were now left with no choice but to demand accountability. Yet, despite the glaring violations of basic human rights, nothing seemed to change. The facility remained overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded. And as the years passed, the culture of neglect and violence continued to fester. For Diddy, it was more than just a nightmare. It was a fight for survival in a system that seemed intent on breaking him, mentally and physically. Even as he struggled to adjust to the reality of his incarceration, he knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but the true cost of survival in MDC Brooklyn would not be measured in days or months. It would be measured in the pieces of humanity Diddy would lose along the way. From the very moment Diddy was transferred to the Metropolitan Detention Center, he was thrust into the Special Housing Unit (SHU), a notorious section of the facility meant to house high-profile inmates, ostensibly for their protection. But as anyone familiar with SHU will attest, the so-called protection comes at a steep and unforgiving price. Life inside SHU is a grueling existence of near-total isolation, where inmates are confined to their cells for up to 23 hours a day. The rare reprieve comes in the form of a solitary hour, where inmates are allowed to leave their cells and engage in minimal physical activity, stretching their legs or walking in a small, confined space. But even that small freedom does little to alleviate the crushing monotony. The stifling isolation becomes a mental prison, one that wears away at a person's sanity, creating a suffocating atmosphere where every hour feels longer than the last. Inside SHU, Diddy's daily reality was dominated by constant tension. The people around him were not just ordinary criminals. These were individuals accused of serious federal offenses, some of the most dangerous and notorious figures in the criminal world. Diddy was surrounded by people with no regard for the value of life, forced to share space with men whose presence was a constant reminder of the brutality that existed behind those cold iron bars. To survive in such an environment required not only physical endurance but a mental toughness that few could maintain. It was a dangerous game, one in which the stakes were nothing less than life itself. Even the simplest movements, like being moved from one area of the prison to another, were fraught with fear and danger. Diddy was shackled at all times, surrounded by a heavily armed guard detail, his every step closely monitored. It was a stark contrast to the life of freedom he had once known, a life of luxury and control. Now, every moment of his existence was governed by the strictest protocols, as though his very being was a threat that had to be contained at all costs. The claustrophobic nature of this existence, the constant surveillance, and the overwhelming isolation were physically and mentally exhausting. What once seemed like an unimaginable nightmare had now become Diddy's cold, harsh reality. But the isolation and surveillance were not the only threats Diddy faced at MDC Brooklyn. The facility was infamous not just for its overcrowding and isolation, but for the pervasive culture of violence that ran through every corridor. It wasn't uncommon for inmates to lash out at one another, driven by the hopelessness and frustration that festered in such a toxic environment. The prison guards, who were meant to maintain order, were often absent or indifferent to the chaos unfolding around them, allowing violence to spiral unchecked. Life in MDC Brooklyn felt disposable, a place where inmates were nothing more than numbers, their survival hinging on their ability to navigate a dangerous world of cruelty, abuse, and neglect. The violence was a daily reality, but it was compounded by another dark issue: the abysmal lack of basic human necessities. In 2019, the facility was plunged into chaos during a brutal winter storm when a catastrophic electrical failure left the entire prison without power for an entire week. The temperature inside the facility dropped to an unbearable 2 degrees F, and with no heat, no lights, and no way to stay warm, inmates were forced to endure conditions that could only be described as inhumane. Desperate cries for help rang out as inmates banged on windows, but their pleas went unanswered. The situation escalated, sparking protests and leading to a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the 1,600 inmates trapped inside. The lawsuit exposed the horrors of life at MDC Brooklyn: broken toilets, a complete lack of fresh air, no access to sunlight, and conditions so bad that even federal judges were compelled to step in, condemning the facility for failing to meet even the most basic standards of decency. Despite the public outcry and legal action, MDC Brooklyn continued to operate with little regard for its inmates' well-being. The facility was plagued by chronic understaffing, insufficient health care, and a lack of resources, creating an environment where violence, neglect, and suffering were commonplace. Over the past 3 years alone, 4 inmates had died, victims of a system that seemed incapable of providing even the most fundamental care. Medical neglect was rampant, with inmates regularly reporting inadequate treatment, poor conditions, and a complete disregard for their health. The situation was compounded by the smuggling of drugs into the facility, which further deteriorated the prison's already fragile state. Diddy's legal team highlighted these issues in court filings, documenting his deteriorating physical and mental health and making a desperate plea for action. But despite the clear and undeniable evidence of the prison's failures, the system remained indifferent, and Diddy continued to endure the cruel conditions that had become his daily existence. At MDC Brooklyn, Diddy's struggle was not just against the charges he faced, but against a broken and deeply flawed system that seemed determined to crush his spirit. The conditions were unbearable, the violence rampant, and the neglect profound. But through it all, Diddy fought to maintain his sense of self, trying to hold on to the remnants of the life he once knew. His battle was not just for his freedom, but for his humanity, as he faced a brutal and unforgiving reality within the confines of a broken prison system. But it wasn't just the appalling lack of basic necessities, food, water, medical care, that made MDC Brooklyn a living nightmare for Diddy. The constant threat of violence was another unbearable reality. The prison was notorious for its explosive and often deadly outbreaks of violence. In 2024 alone, 2 separate stabbings sent shockwaves through the facility, with inmates killed in brutal, unprovoked attacks. Just months before Diddy's arrival, an inmate had been stabbed 44 times by a group of MS-13 gang members in a brutal assault, an attack that was captured on the prison's surveillance cameras. The violence inside MDC Brooklyn was escalating rapidly, and there was no indication that it would slow down. In such an environment, no one, least of all someone as high-profile as Diddy, was safe. By the time Diddy's defense attorney, Brian Steele, took his case to court, the physical, mental, and emotional toll of his imprisonment had already taken its toll. Diddy had endured months of terror, fear, and constant anxiety, trapped in a facility where violence, neglect, and danger were an everyday reality. His legal team had filed multiple motions with the court, highlighting the threats to his life and the unbearable conditions he was being subjected to. They pleaded for his protection, but their requests seemed to fall on deaf ears. Even the federal judges, once indifferent to the plights of inmates in the system, began to take notice of the severity of the situation. As one judge noted in January 2024, it had become routine for judges to reduce sentences for defendants being held at MDC, recognizing the inhumane conditions they were forced to endure. Prosecutors, who had once defended the prison system's operations, no longer fought these reductions. They too understood the truth: MDC Brooklyn was no longer a facility designed to uphold justice. It had become a place of unchecked punishment, a place where the system's failure to protect its inmates was plain for all to see. Yet, it wasn't only the physical dangers Diddy faced within MDC Brooklyn, it was the psychological warfare that wore him down every single day. The constant intimidation, the power plays, and the ever-present threat of violence left a deep psychological scar. Charlie Finney, one of Diddy's longtime friends, revealed the chilling truth about life behind bars. "Everything in prison is designed to break you down," she said. "It's psychological warfare. I could hurt you at any time." For someone like Diddy, who had spent his life in the public eye, accustomed to luxury, fame, and control, the brutal reality of prison life was hard to reconcile. In the prison system, fame didn't protect you, it made you a target. Every inmate saw an opportunity to elevate their own status by harming him. Violence in the prison system was currency, and for those desperate for reputation, hurting a celebrity like Diddy could propel them to instant notoriety within the prison's brutal pecking order. The motivations behind these attacks were clear. Fame and respect in the criminal underworld of prison life were earned through violence and dominance. The more violent your reputation, the more power you held. For someone like Diddy, whose entire life had been built on his celebrity status, this harsh reality was difficult to process. He was no longer the music mogul, the icon who ruled the entertainment industry. Instead, he was just another inmate facing down men who had nothing to lose, in a system that operated on fear and power. Every interaction, every moment spent behind bars was fraught with the constant threat of violence, and Diddy was forced to reckon with this brutal truth every day. Despite the overwhelming odds, Diddy refused to back down. Despite the constant intimidation, the psychological warfare, and the mounting physical threats, he remained defiant. He wasn't going to let prison break him, not mentally, not emotionally. Though the system tried to strip him of his dignity and his identity, Diddy held firm, refusing to be crushed under the weight of his circumstances. He wasn't going to allow the prison to steal his will to survive. He maintained his resolve, his sense of self, even as everything around him seemed to collapse into chaos. The prison may have been a place of darkness and despair, but Diddy's spirit remained unbroken, his defiance shining through in the face of it all. He was determined to hold on to his humanity, even as the system tried to take it from him piece by piece. Through it all, Diddy's fight was more than just for his freedom, it was a battle for his very soul. Despite the overwhelming brutality of MDC Brooklyn, he refused to let the prison break him. His legal team fought to secure his release, but Diddy was also fighting his own inner battle, one of resilience, strength, and defiance. It was a fight that would continue long after his time in MDC Brooklyn, a fight that would define who he was, both behind bars and beyond them. By the time Diddy finally arrived at Fort Dix in New Jersey in 2025, the nightmare that had been MDC Brooklyn was behind him, but its echoes still reverberated in his mind. The physical toll of those months in isolation, the constant threat of violence, and the crushing psychological weight of his incarceration had left indelible marks on him. Though the oppressive, violent atmosphere of MDC Brooklyn was no longer a daily reality, the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain with him for the rest of his life. At Fort Dix, a low-security federal prison, the environment was a marked contrast to what he had experienced in Brooklyn, but even here, peace and safety were never guaranteed. Fort Dix was supposed to be a place where Diddy could focus on rehabilitation, a chance to begin rebuilding his life physically and mentally away from the harrowing environment of his former prison. But the truth, as many inmates will tell you, is that safety is never given in federal custody. Even in low-security facilities like Fort Dix, the threat of violence and danger always lurked just beneath the surface. Joe Judich, a former inmate with first-hand experience in federal prisons, explained it bluntly: life in federal custody can be just as dangerous in any facility. As long as he keeps a low profile, he'll be fine, but you never know, people get hurt over the smallest things. It's a dangerous place. In Fort Dix, as in every other prison, survival was a matter of vigilance, careful negotiation of the unspoken rules of power, and knowing when to stand your ground and when to retreat into the shadows. While Diddy's physical environment had changed, the psychological toll of his incarceration did not disappear. At Fort Dix, Diddy was assigned to work in the prison's media library, distributing movies and religious materials to fellow inmates. It was a relatively low-profile role, but it provided him with some semblance of purpose. The act of providing entertainment and solace to others was in some ways a small measure of redemption. He also took on laundry duty, washing clothes and cleaning the facility. These were humble tasks, a stark contrast to the lavish life of a mogul surrounded by luxury. The reality of moving from an opulent mansion to the dull grind of prison labor was profound, yet Diddy approached his new responsibilities with a sense of quiet resolve. It was a fall from grace, to be sure, but Diddy recognized the necessity of focusing on his rehabilitation. He was learning to live within his limitations, to do what was required of him, to accept the painful process of reinvention. Despite the seeming calm of Fort Dix compared to the violence of MDC Brooklyn, trouble still had a way of finding Diddy. In November 2025, an alcohol-related incident once again put him in a precarious position. The details of the situation were swiftly addressed, and Diddy avoided any serious repercussions, but it served as a stark reminder that his journey was far from over. He had survived the brutality of Brooklyn's special housing unit, but the fight for his mental and emotional survival would continue. Even in Fort Dix, where he was supposedly safer, he was forced to constantly navigate the underlying threats that existed within the prison system. This incident underscored a crucial reality. The battle for survival in prison is not only physical but psychological. The constant strain of watching one's back, the pressure of never fully trusting anyone, the mental exhaustion of living under the weight of such constant uncertainty, these were things that Diddy, like every inmate, had to contend with every day. Prison was more than just the absence of freedom, it was a constant psychological siege. Whether it was the stress of violence or the subtle intimidation of fellow inmates, the toll on Diddy's mind was profound. He had spent his life in the spotlight, surrounded by fame, wealth, and comfort, but now he was forced to confront a world where status meant nothing, and survival required far more than influence or power. He was stripped of everything he had once taken for granted, forced to rebuild from the ground up, and still the battle for his mind and soul raged on. Through all of this, Diddy remained resilient. His legal team fought tirelessly to secure his release, but Diddy understood that his true battle was not just for his freedom, it was for his survival, his dignity, and his humanity. He could not allow the prison system or the brutal conditions it imposed to break him. He had already survived the worst that MDC Brooklyn had to offer. Now, he needed to prove to himself that he could survive the psychological toll of life in Fort Dix. This was a fight that would not be won through courtroom victories or legal appeals alone. It was a fight for his spirit, his will to live, and his ability to adapt to a world that had tried to strip him of everything that once defined him. Diddy's story was one of enduring strength in the face of crushing adversity. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, he refused to back down. The odds were always against him, whether it was the constant threat of violence, the crushing monotony of prison life, or the psychological warfare waged by the system itself. But Diddy's determination was unwavering. He remained focused on the one goal that had sustained him throughout his ordeal: freedom. The road ahead remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: Diddy was no stranger to struggle. He had grown up in Harlem, a place where survival was earned through grit, resilience, and sheer will. Or the lessons of survival he had learned in his youth in a place where life could be unforgiving had prepared him for this moment. His fight for justice was not just a legal battle, it was a fight for his very soul, a fight that would determine who he would become once he emerged from the darkness of the prison system. Though the road was long and filled with obstacles, Diddy remained steadfast. His journey through the prison system was far from over, but every day he spent behind bars was a testament to his strength and his refusal to be broken. The battle for his future was a relentless one, and as he continued to fight for his freedom, he understood that this struggle, this fight to survive, was not just about the circumstances of his imprisonment. It was about who he would be on the other side of it. A man who had endured the darkest chapters of his life and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. As Diddy navigated the harshest conditions in MDC Brooklyn, one question remained: would he survive this relentless nightmare? And could he ever find a way out, not just from the prison, but from the trauma that would stay with him forever? This fight, this struggle, was just the beginning of the toughest battle Diddy had ever faced, and he was ready for it. If you're captivated by Diddy's story and want to hear what happens next, don't miss the next chapter. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned as we uncover more of this shocking, untold saga. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.